We all know that as part of the generational conflicts that are going on right now within our own nations, a huge part of that is the information war, because he who controls what information is spread to the masses has an immense amount of societal control, especially within the democratic system, when really the currency is information more than anything else. That's why large interest groups, most of the time, they take over financial institutions and also media and entertainment institutions, because that way you have the two main vectors of societal control under your thumb. Wikipedia is, despite the fact that everybody was taught in school that you shouldn't trust Wikipedia or use it as a reliable source, it is used by most people as at least a basic way to get a cursory understanding of any information that you're looking for. It maybe shouldn't be, but I would say Wikipedia pages are about as good as the editors who've edited those pages are. So if you found a page where maybe there's one really dedicated artist who cares about the subject that not many people know about, you're liable to actually get some good information, and at the very least you'll get some good sources from it. If you have a Wikipedia page that is subject to mass edits from a bunch of insane leftists, well then you're liable to be being fed misinformation and active disinformation. And that is what has happened recently to the Wikipedia page that was available for the grooming gangs crisis within the UK.
2 years ago, we also covered when the page for grooming was created, and it was the grooming conspiracy theory, the LGBT grooming conspiracy theory. And we went through the notes, and it was a bunch of leftists saying that these obviously predatory practices in schools to sexualize children's education were just made up, even though they were readily available to read the materials and they had been widely reported and cited in actual government reports.
Yeah, so what will happen with something like that, and the grooming gangs page has had very, very similar treatment, is that they will completely eschew all of the more reliable reports and sources that you can take, and take the one or two sources that match the narrative that they want to spread and solely rely on those. Oftentimes, if you go into the editing history, you'll find that there's essentially been a war going on, but inevitably with these sorts of things, because right-wingers as a whole tend not to be as switched on to these, mainly because they have families and jobs and actual responsibilities, you'll find that the leftists tend to swarm and get the upper hand, and the Wikipedia page becomes basically unusable for reliable information, which is a shame because it is a website that is one of the most visited on the internet.
And this does come back to what I was saying in my segment, which is the right needs to get to grips with the digital world. You know, so many of us are just completely out of touch on that front. We need to understand that even something as mundane as Wikipedia is a battleground. It's a castle that we need to capture.
It absolutely is. But what you can do if you're looking for reliable and interesting information is you can buy a copy of issue 2 of Islander, which is still available for the time being, but by the end of this week, I'm speaking now on Wednesday the 9th of October, by the end of this week it will no longer be for sale. Very limited run, so get it while you still can. Same with the rest of the merchandise that we have available on the website. So to go into the information of what's happened here, so Wikipedia, as I've mentioned, has the grooming gangs page that was previously titled Muslim Grooming Gangs in the United Kingdom. On the 7th of October, interestingly enough, this was renamed to Grooming Gang Moral Panic in the United Kingdom.
Oh, that's morally despicable.
Yes. So Moral Panic, I actually found the Wikipedia page for it, interestingly enough, was a term developed by a man called Stanley Cohen that states, who stated that moral panic happens when a condition, obviously I think the phrase itself existed before then, but he popularized it in his modern understanding. Moral panic happens when a condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. While the issues identified may be real, the claims exaggerate the seriousness, extent, typicality, and or inevitability of harm. It is often considered academically by academics to be irrational. So it's clearly a way to try and smear the very, very well-known factual documented cases of Asian, and by that I mean Middle Eastern, Pakistani primarily, ethnic grooming gangs who specifically went out of their way to target white British girls and groom them, is using that as a way to try and smear it by applying this term which people have been taught in schools. Well, moral panic was when Mary Whitehouse thought that rock and roll was for Satanists. But moral panic is when we were burning witches at the stake.
A great
so it's
example.
already associated in people's minds with something that is untrue.
Yeah, I love as well, by the way, that it says, like, yeah, it might be real. It's like, yeah, you know, girls might be being raped up and down the country by immigrants, but don't panic about it.
Well, it's
don't worry about
exaggerated.
it. Yeah.
It's exaggerated. I mean, if it's only 1 or 2, why should you care?
If it's only a million, if it's only thousands, then
Well, it literally is thousands because Asian-led British government by Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman set up a grooming gangs task force after the GB News expose done by the excellent Charlie Peters, and they found so far 1,500 perpetrators and at least 4,000 victims. So is that a moral panic? And another great example of the moral panic that's been embedded in schools is the fact that Arthur Miller's The Crucible is a set text for GCSE
I learned
English.
about it during GCSE English. Yeah.
Exactly. I had to perform it during drama because everyone in right-wing politics is a failed theatre kid. Exactly. But in that set the idea that not only was the Salem witch trials completely made up, which of course it was, but as an allegory, all of the House on Un-American Activities Committee's hearings, the McCarthy era, even though McCarthy didn't chair those, searching for communists embedded in the US government, were purely fictitious and made up. And it's like, no, there were actually lots of them. It wasn't a moral panic. It was
now they're in
perfect
charge.
legitimate. Yeah, well, they were running cartoonist unions and things like that. So this is, you're right, completely embedded.
FDR's administration was made up of quite a few communist infiltrators, one of whom organised the Bretton Woods Agreement on behalf of the US and screwed over Britain.
Yeah, so this is completely embedded in, let's say, the default liberal psyche, that as soon as they hear moral panic, they can just write it off. It's been rendered radioactive. So this is what this is trying to do.
It's absolutely trying to give people an excuse to dismiss it, and if you ask why, well, they can either point to the Wikipedia page, or they can point to the source that the Wikipedia page is using, which I'll refer to in a moment. First, they point out in this unheard article that every Wikipedia article has a talk function which allows users to request and debate edits. The change was confirmed by a user named Scepter, who wrote there is a consensus if the article is to be kept, and for the meanwhile it is to be kept, so they might actually just delete the page off of the website altogether, that moral panic should be included in the article to reflect how the subject is dealt with in reliable sources.
So apologetic press for the establishment that imported all of these groomers.
Yes, leftist media and leftist infiltrators within government departments writing reports, which is the main one that they'll be referring to. As they say in here, the Wikipedia article states that right-wing and far-right activists popularised the term Muslim grooming gangs, despite the majority of the offenders being of Pakistani heritage. The article also refers to a 2020 Home Office report which found no links between ethnicity and child sexual abuse.
That's a total lie. That's an actual lie. That's
I've got it. I've got it in the next link, so we can go through that in a moment. In the announcement of the article's title change, the question of ethnicity is addressed. Quote, there was a late discussion about the possible title of ethnicity but I cannot find a consensus for the inclusion yet, writes the same user Scepter. Nor can I find a consensus for the inclusion of the word Muslim. However, if after informal and possible formal discussions such a consensus emerges, that can easily be revisited. So complete appeal to popularity, appeal to this imaginary consensus. Well, I've not been able to find anything that suggests that lots of people agree with me, so therefore that agrees with the idea that it should be ethnicity, therefore I'm going to leave it out altogether.
I don't mean to be cliched, but I think there was a mid-century English socialist who might have written a book about this kind of thing happening, by the name, it was like 1987? 1945, something like that. I don't know. Anyway,
I don't know what you could be on about.
Interesting, yeah, but it's just fascinating how we do now live in this time where information is, because this might as well be saying, when the party says, then we will change it to these various different types.
Ironically, Prevent put that on its watch list of texts frequented by the far right, the exact kind of people they say that are spreading this moral panic. Without a hint of irony, 1984 was on
I
that.
remember how what was Prevent started to prevent as well? Why was it preventing? What was it preventing? Was it British people standing up for their own interests? No, it was supposed to be against Islamic terrorists.
Well,
I
you
remember.
say that. I mean, look at my expose on the website. It was ostensibly about Islamic terror. It has since, under Raiku, become an exercise in propagandizing the British people anytime there is a Muslim terror attack to, quote, don't look back in anger. Because remember, the response to Manchester Arena was centrally planned by the government using our tax money.
Yes, so the whole reason that Prevent was started in the first place was a lie. So the government lied. Big surprise. While the title change request was granted, it wasn't unanimously supported. One user wrote, it seems to me that I don't like it or it's too offensive to me/others are at play here, and I ask the community to be wary of changing the article's title on that ground. If sources say Muslim Asian grooming gangs, then we should leave it as is. It is irrelevant what the far-right groups say or how it may or may not play into their narrative. So this person, I assume, is probably also a leftist if they're saying far-right groups, but at least they're somebody with a bit of honesty and integrity sensitivity to them. So fair play for speaking up. That's not changed the Wikipedia page from being changed, because as you can see here, this is what it looks like at the moment. Moral panic about groups referred to, yada yada, right-wing and far-right activists, as well as more mainstream individuals. That's a nice vague term there.
Well, BBC Newsnight.
Yeah, helped popularise the terminology in 2010s. Here is the paper that they are referring to, Group-Based Child Sexual Exploitation Characteristics of Offending, from the Home Office in 2020. This was a large report that was done under Preeti Patel.
No, it was commissioned by Sajid Javid, himself Pakistani heritage.
Yes, I believe I saw that Preeti Patel had, when she was Home Secretary, had said that this report was very, very disappointing. But if you look, I looked through this, you can search for the terms. Not once is there a use of the word religion or religious, so they're not even looking into that as a factor. The word Muslim only appears once in the whole document, and that's in a reference note quoting the Muslim Women's Network, I believe. But they do have a bit here about ethnicity, because the key findings are basically that ethnicity doesn't really play into anything, and even if you do really consider ethnicity, well, the majority of these cases are done by white people anyway, and it ignores the disproportionate nature of some of the cases. But there is some quality information that you can find under the subheading of ethnicity. Would you like to say what you're looking to say?
Pakistani perpetrators, according to this data, are 3 times more likely per capita than the white British to commit this.
Yes.
Many of the actual acts that have been put through the courts and resulted in far too lenient prosecutions have involved the girls saying that they made me stand in a corner and look at the floor, called me a white slag, they made me read Quranic verses, they deliberately plied me with drugs and alcohol because they knew that I was a non-believer, and so they and the families of the grooming gang perpetrators, who, in the recent trial in Rotherham, had the daughters who knew what their dad had done say, "I love you, Dad," as he was sent to prison, have covered this up as a community, and the community is Pakistani and Muslim. And thanks to, again, Charlie Peters, if you dig into the statistics, it's something like 1 in every 1,000 Muslim men in Rotherham and 1 in every 700 in Telford were guilty of this. So this was
I actually
a community
have
organised
the
factor.
number for Rotherham. It was 1 in 73 Rotherham Muslims.
1 in 73?
Yes.
Blimey, okay.
Can I just say, I mean, this is a point that I like to make because I think that it's a really interesting and useful perspective to take. But thinking about how this period of history through which we're living will be reported and taught to our descendants in, say, 200 years' time, this story in particular, I think, will be viewed as being one of the most insane and evil things to have ever taken place on this country's soil. Because, you know, you think about how it will be reported, oh yeah, well, in the early part of the 21st century, there was this thing that happened where the government made it a policy to bring in millions of foreigners from the Middle East, and thousands of them set about raping the indigenous population, primarily young girls, because they were white and because they were English. And then at every level of the state, from the actual police officers at the bottom level right the way up to MPs in Parliament, they covered it up because they were scared of being called racist.
MPs and lords were actually involved in this at one point.
It's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I can't put into words how angry this story makes me, and it's difficult to not get worked up about it. But
yes, but I'll go through a little bit of the information that's in here, because a lot of the reporting from outlets like The Guardian speaking about this really harped on the editorial writing that was included in this to try to dismiss the information that they do include, because there is a lot of good hard data that you can find in this report that mainly comes from previous studies. It's kind of a collation of different studies, but they add a lot of editorializing around it to try and dismiss it by saying things like, research on offender ethnicity is limited and tends to rely on poor quality data, therefore difficult to draw conclusions about differences in ethnicity of offenders, but it's likely that no one community or culture is uniquely predisposed to offending. So women like Ella Cockbain, who wrote for The Guardian when this report came out, saying that, oh, it's more to do with power dynamics and the attempts of patriarchal men to submit and oppress women, which I would say, yes, definitely was a factor in it, but mainly it was an ethnic factor on top of that. they use these bits of editorializing to dismiss all of the rest of the information, because really, let's be honest, that's all that most people were reading for when they were trying to look at this report and what it said, so that they could just find anything possible, like the Wikipedia page has done, to exclude the idea that ethnicity had anything to do with it. They also say a number of studies have indicated an overrepresentation of Asian and black offenders in group-based child sexual exploitation. Most of the same studies show that the majority of offenders are white. Yeah, but it's not about majority, because obviously in a majority white country, the majority of the offenders of any crime you would expect to be the native ethnicity.
Yes, per capita.
Yeah, per capita.
But not just that.
Overrepresentation is the problem that we're pointing to.
Every single crime committed by a foreign national was optional.
Yes.
It has been brought here by the government, so it is their fault. So none of these crimes needed to happen. If you have a British-born rapist, I agree, given the harshest possible penalty or the death penalty, because that is our problem to deal with. It doesn't mean, because they exist, import more rapists. It doesn't follow.
Well, this is a conversation
what about
that
the
is...
tasty recipes, though?
Oh, that's a great point. So many people find this so difficult to understand, though, because I've had conversations with people where I've said, the Manchester Arena bombing, for example,
Didn't need to happen.
Didn't need to happen. It was a result of a government policy. And they'll say to me, well, we had bombings in this country in the 90s and before. We had bombings because of the IRA. And it's like, yeah, but that is fundamentally different, because those people are native to these isles. It was a homegrown problem. We didn't need, therefore, then the additional problem of foreign terrorists in the country. We had enough of our own to deal with. And so this is the key point, is it's part of a government policy. And this is so crucial. Whenever we talk about issues around immigration, it always has to come back to, yeah, there are problematic individual immigrants, but the actual culprits, the actual people who have to be brought to justice in our lifetimes for these problems are the elites, are the governments that we've had for the last however many decades.
Civil servants that have stayed there and deliberately obstructed the data getting out, that have obstructed the will of ministers that try to reduce it. And any time one of these terror attacks happens, they give money to Raiku and tell us don't look back in anger.
Yeah.
Yes, there certainly does need to be punishments for what's happened, but this page of this report is actually quite interesting, because it does include a lot of the information from large-scale studies that have been conducted looking into this phenomenon. And again, if you ignore the editorializing around it, the information that they give here is very telling. So CEOP in 2011 undertook a data collection with police forces, children's services and specialist providers from the voluntary sector looking at those allegedly involved in street grooming and child sexual exploitation. Data was returned on approximately 2,300 possible offenders. Approximately 1,100 were excluded from the analysis, but in the remaining 1,200 cases, ethnicity data was unknown for 38%. Of the available data that we do have, 30% of the offenders were white, while 28% were Asian. Due to the amount of missing data, blah, blah, blah. In 2013, CEOP undertook a second piece of work in this space. Data was requested from all police forces in England and Wales on contact child sexual assault, and responses were received from 31. Of the 52 groups where data provided was usable, half of the groups consisted of all Asian offenders. Half of them, 26 groups. 11 were all white, 4 were all black, and 2 were exclusively Arab. So they say here, looking at the offenders across all groups, of the 306 offenders, 75% were Asian. However, as with the 2011 study, these figures should be treated with caution due to the amount of missing data. So they do say that despite the fact that we have we do have some substantial data, and of that data that we do have, it seems to point very clearly to a massive overrepresentation of Middle Eastern, Asian ethnicities committing these sorts of crimes. We still can't draw any conclusions, right? We can't draw any conclusions from it, and that's what The Guardian runs with. But then, just a few paragraphs later, they come out with this line, which does suggest that even without the information available, we can draw some conclusions, though. Based on the existing evidence and our understanding of the flaws in the existing data, it seems most likely that the ethnicity of group-based child sexual exploitation offenders is in line with CSA more generally, and with general population, with the majority of offenders being white.
So 3 things on that. Number 1, we're investigating the grooming gangs, which is an ethnically and religiously motivated crime in particular towns and cities, so the perpetrators are of a particular ethnicity. So just saying, but all child exploitation... No, that's not the point. If you're trying to quash a problem, you get specific. So they're just hiding this, they know it's the problem, and they're lying. Secondly, it's not Asians. It's not the Japanese doing this. It's not the Sikhs
Well,
doing
yeah,
this.
it's an incredibly broad term.
Yeah, it's deliberately vague. It's Pakistanis and it's Muslims. And it's every single time, which means...
But again, they didn't even look into any religious element that went into this when they did this report.
Which means it's an insufficient report. But it does mean we know the group that are doing it. We shouldn't import more of them. We should import all of them. And the final thing about this is that, okay, we don't have enough data to get a conclusive number. All right, so then why do you assume one way? Because I could quite happily assume, if you don't have enough data, then it means that
more. Yeah.
it's probably more. It's probably absolute, and you have an ideological motivation to not suppose it's more, so it probably is.
Well, this is a really important point, right? So being in the kind of think tanky circles that I occasionally move in, there's a real consensus that the UK is what gets called a data desert. We just don't have so much data, especially on issues like this, which is an enormous failing because there's plenty of countries, again, looking to Europe for examples, who collect data in the most granular detail when it comes down to things like ethnicity and so on. And we just don't do it in this country because if we did, there would be outrage at the findings because it would show the entire project that the elites have been undertaking for the better part of 30 years is a total failure, and the entire apparatus and infrastructure of the state exists to justify its failure.
Can I be difficult and correct you on that? We do actually collect it, they don't publish it. Because anytime internal civil servants have asked this, Stephen Edgington did an expose recently, Rycroft and our old friend Jess Phillips are completely stum. Patrick Christis and the show over at GB News tried paying, because they put in a Freedom of Information request, they tried paying the Home Office the full fees to compile and publish the data because the Home Office said and the Ministry of Justice said too expensive, can't afford the manpower. When they offered them all the money for it, they still said no. They just don't want it out there.
Well, there is a certain scale that means that I can understand from the perspective. If I think of myself, I'm an evil civil servant. Let's put myself in that perspective. There's a measure of scale that means that even Raikou wouldn't be able to put a lid on what happened, because if you actually had that information out there, judging by some of the reactions that happened to situations earlier this year, it would be Southport by a factor of 100.
Yes.
And I don't think there would be any amount of propaganda once you release that information. And honestly, when people like us and GB News and other outlets began to make that more well-known among the public, there's nothing that could put that back on.
Yeah, and of course, none of us encourage violence, but the only thing that stops those riots weren't even the Raikou efforts that had, which you publicised, all of the newspapers simultaneously showing stand up to racism demonstrations as a purely organic thing in response to the hundreds of far-right protests which Nick Lowles admitted were hoaxes. It was just Keir Starmer getting even more draconian in applying two-tier justice standards and giving 2-year sentences for Facebook posts while letting out the exact kind of perpetrators of these sexual crimes. They realise their propaganda efforts aren't even working anymore, so they need to get even more punitive in terms of the justice system.
But even then, we're such a country in such decline, we're so useless and incompetent on a national level that they won't even really be able to practically enforce that past a certain point because of the lack of infrastructure we have to house criminals. We covered this on a round table that if you have a membership on the website, which you should do, you can watch. I think we all included some really good information in that. But anyway, back to the Wikipedia article. Would it surprise anybody to find out that this was the person who edited it? Grooming gang page change was made by @SarahLicity, who self-describes as trans, feminist, atheist, and progressive-minded student, who also in their Twitter bio I'm assuming it's a he, really, so I'm going to go with a he. He calls himself a non-binary dyke. So
XE, they, she, and a European flag in there, and a mixtress of mathematics.
And wrestling fangirl, wrestling, that incredibly feminine pastime that girls across the country love. Interestingly enough, I wanted to make sure that I have verified it myself. This is the right person, because I didn't see much verification going on. On Wikipedia, you can find the page, the user page of the person who edited it, Scepter, and I went on it, and there is a Twitter link linking to that account. So this is correct information. Unsurprisingly, he locked it. What a big surprise. But somebody in the replies to this linked something very interesting, which is a 2015 Breitbart article about this person. Because Mr. Sarah Mr. Sarah Noble has been quite notorious.
Sorry, you sound like a Nigerian scammer.
Yeah.
Sarah.
But he's been quite notorious for a good few years at this point, because back in 2015, he was a Lib Dem activist who almost got kicked out of the party. I think did get kicked out of the party because he was sharing on his Twitter page, "Kill all men, F men, die cisgendered scum." Now, this was a man who was sitting on 2 National Party committees, and he was suspended from this. He was sat on the LGBT Liberal Democrats and the Secular and Humanist Liberal Democrats. He'd also been elected to the Executive Committee of the National Union of Students LGBT wing. So, a usual suspect.
The former Lib Dem, I can see there, leader, then Equalities Minister Jo Swinson, who herself didn't know what a woman was, has even come out and condemned Noble's comments personally. So... yes, this is a high-profile nutcase.
But because of how Wikipedia operates, with its kind of decentralized and democratic mode of working, it means that this person has an outsized amount of control over the information that is available to people on the Wikipedia pages, including the Grooming Gang one. This is the kind of person who is editing those pages and trying to make you convinced that it's just a moral panic that you should dismiss and not think about further.
There was a time when we had asylums in this country.
Yes.
This is the thing with
these
sorts of people, right? You know, you can look at them and you think, oh, they're a political enemy and they're very, they're sort of scheming. No, this person is deeply, deeply mentally ill.
Or mental.
Yeah.
Or he's just a porn addict who's got a job as a Discord mod or a Twitch
but
mod.
You repeat yourself.
And does this on the does this on the side.
Either way, mental, not to be trusted. And to go back over some of the information that proves that it's not just a moral panic, it is something that people should be deeply concerned about and outraged about. Again, Jack Anderson was the one who shared that information. 1 in 73 Muslim men who live in Rotherham have been prosecuted for grooming gang-related crimes in the past 2 decades. Keith Woods, who I'm not always in agreement with, but sadly has had his YouTube channel taken down recently without any reason given other than hate speech, even though his channel was actually very mild for the most part compared to his other platforms. So that was completely unfair. He shared this, and he shared, of course, the headlines: over or almost 19,000 children identified as sexual exploitation victims in England. Interestingly enough, Peter McLaughlin, who is the man who's recently written the manifesto with Tommy Robinson, has previously done a study and book about the grooming gangs called Easy Meat, and he estimated it might actually be closer to over 100,000 in total. Probably more than that. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes up to 1 million.
Well, I think that the cornerstone, no matter what the numbers are, because we've got different numbers, the cornerstone should be that Charlene Downs' name should be as well known as George Floyd. Charlene Downs was the young girl.
Far more well known.
Yeah, quite. Charlene Downs was the young girl in Blackpool who was sexually exploited by a grooming gang and whose body was ground up into kebab meat and sold and used as tile grouting for the kebab shop. And her abusers laughed about this and boasted about it, and they got off on a technicality because of improper evidence gathering methods.
Now, I
never had justice.
I learnt about that story when I was probably... I don't know. I was young when I learned about that story because she had the same name as me. And as you do, I was Googling my own name. And I was like, oh, there's a Wikipedia page on a Charlie Downs. Let's read that. And then I became aware of the kind of stuff that goes on in this country.
And if you want to be more aware of what goes on in the country, it's so well documented and so not a moral panic that you should throw away, that we actually have a premium video on the website giving a breakdown of the timeline of the grooming gangs. That's how well documented it is. You can go date by date and draw this out in a very straight line. It's very, very clear and very, very well documented
there as well.
Yes, and
100% diverse.
And there has been some justice for this. There was a recent segment that you did, The Silence is Deafening, about the grooming gangs trials. There has been some justice on this, but nowhere near enough.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see more of what we're up to, you can follow Dan's series, Brokenomics. Here he's talking about Tony Blair's new book on leadership. And if you want to see all the other work we're putting out, you can follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.